On March 21, 1935, a single decision erased a name that had existed for over 2,000 years. Persia, gone. In its place, Iran. To the outside world, it looked like a minor change, a simple update in diplomatic language. But this wasn't just a name. It was an attempt to rewrite history, reshape identity, and break free from a century of foreign control. The man behind it was not born a king. He was a soldier who took power and tried to rebuild an entire nation from the ground up. But the path he chose would pull his country into one of the most dangerous geopolitical games of the 20th century. And the consequences of that decision still shape Iran and its relationship with the world today. On March 21, 1935, the day of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, a telegram arrived at every foreign embassy in Tehran. It was a short, clinical memo from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it carried the weight of 3,000 years of history. It requested that from this day forward, the international community cease using the name Persia, and instead use the name Iran. To diplomats in London, Paris, and Washington, it seemed like a trivial semantic whim. To the British Foreign Office, it was an absurd note from a sensitive monarch. But to the man who signed that decree, Reza Shah Pahlavi, it was a declaration of war against the past. For centuries, Persia was a name given by outsiders, a Greek exonym that reduced a vast multi-ethnic empire to a single province. To the West, Persia evoked images of silk carpets, poetry, and a decaying, weak monarchy that had been bullied by empires for 100 years. Reza Shah wanted to kill that image. He didn't want a land of poets. He wanted a land of steel, railways, and soldiers. He wanted a name that reflected the land of the Aryans, a name his people had used internally for millennia. This is the story of how a common soldier rose from the ranks to become the king of kings, how he attempted to drag a medieval society into the 20th century by its hair, and how his search for a third force to protect Iranian sovereignty set the stage for a global catastrophe. This is part one of the Pahlavi Era, the dream of sovereignty. To understand why the name change mattered, we have to look at the wreckage Reza Shah inherited. In 1921, the country we now call Iran didn't really exist as a unified state. It was a collection of fiefdoms, tribes, and foreign occupation zones. The ruling Qajar dynasty was in its death throes. Ahmad Shah Qajar was a monarch who preferred the cafes of Nice and Paris to the dusty streets of Tehran. While he vacationed, his country was being carved up. The British controlled the south to protect their oil. The Soviets occupied the north to spread the revolution. Between them lay a central government that couldn't collect taxes, couldn't enforce laws, and didn't even have a unified national army. Enter Reza Khan. He wasn't a prince. He was a soldier of Mazandarani descent who had joined the Persian Cossack brigade at age 14. He was tall, imposing, with eyes that contemporary diplomats described as piercing and terrifying. He had spent his life in the saddle, fighting rebels and bandits. He saw the humiliation of his country firsthand. In February 1921, backed by the British who were desperate for stability to prevent a Bolshevik takeover, Reza Khan marched 3,000 Cossacks from Kashf-e to Tehran. He didn't just seize the capital, he seized the narrative. Within 4 years, he had maneuvered himself from Minister of War to Prime Minister, and finally, in 1925, he deposed the last Qajar and crowned himself Shah. He took the name Pahlavi, a reference to the Middle Persian language of the pre-Islamic Sassanid Empire. From day one, his message was clear. The Islamic era of Persia was a period of decline. The future of Iran lay in its ancient imperial pre-Islamic roots. Reza Shah was a man in a hurry. He looked at Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in Turkey and saw a blueprint. He believed that if Iran didn't modernize immediately, it would be swallowed by the West. But his modernization wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. According to research from the Lion and the Sun podcast, his motto was, "God Shah Nation." But in practice, the Shah came first. First, he built the tools of power. He created a unified national army, growing it from a measly 22,000 men to over 127,000 by 1941. He introduced compulsory military service, which served a dual purpose. It gave him a hammer to crush tribal revolts, and it acted as a melting pot where young men from different ethnicities, Kurds, Azeris, Lurs, were forced to learn Persian and identify as Iranians first. Then came the infrastructure. The crown jewel was the Trans-Iranian Railway. This was a staggering feat of engineering, 1,394 kilometers of track through some of the most brutal mountains on Earth. But the most remarkable thing about it wasn't the engineering, it was the financing. Reza Shah refused to take foreign loans. He had seen how the Qajars had sold the country's soul to British and Russian banks. Instead, he funded the railway by placing a national tax on tea and sugar, the two staples of the Iranian diet. The poor literally built the tracks with their daily meals. As noted by Wikipedia, he turned to neutral firms like the Danish-Swedish consortium Cossack to finish the job, avoiding the great power traps of Britain and the USSR. But his reforms went deeper than steel and stone. He wanted to change the very soul of the people. In 1936, he issued the Kashf-e Hijab, the forced removal of the veil. Police were ordered to pull headscarves off women in the streets. He banned traditional ethnic clothing and forced men to wear the Pahlavi hat and Western suits. He was trying to create a homogeneous, secular, westernized nation overnight. To the urban elite, he was a visionary. To the religious clergy and the rural tribes, he was a tyrant attacking their most sacred traditions. The tension was building, but for a decade, the Shah's iron fist kept the lid on the pot. This brings us back to 1935 and the name change. Why then? And why Iran? As Banafsheh Zand explains, the name Persia carried a stigma of weakness. It reminded the world of the 19th century, of tobacco concessions and lost wars. Iran, however, was a name of strength. It was the name used in the Shahnameh, the national epic. It signaled that the country was not just a province of the British Empire's oil interests, but a sovereign power with a 2,500-year-old lineage. There was also a pragmatic, multi-ethnic reason. Persia refers to the Persians. But the country was home to millions of Azeris, Kurds, and Arabs. By calling the country Iran, Reza Shah was attempting to create a broader national umbrella that could house all these groups under a Persian-centric identity, of course. However, there is a darker shadow over this decision that historians still debate today. In the 1930s, the word Aryan was taking on a toxic new meaning in Europe. Reza Shah was obsessed with finding a third force. He hated the British, who controlled his oil through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. He feared the Soviets, who wanted to export communism. He looked to Germany, first the Weimar Republic, then the Third Reich, as a partner that had no colonial history in the Middle East. By 1935, Germany was Iran's largest trading partner. German engineers were building the bridges. German professors were teaching in the universities. Some critics, like French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy, have argued that the name change to Iran, land of the Aryans, was a nod to Nazi racial ideology. But the truth is more complex. As Caesar.co points out, the name Iran had been used internally for centuries. Reza Shah wasn't a Nazi. He was a nationalist. He used the Aryan connection as a diplomatic tool to get better trade deals and respect from a rising Germany. He was playing the great power game, trying to use Berlin to checkmate London and Moscow. It was a brilliant strategy on paper, But it was a gamble that relied on the world staying at peace. By the late 1930s, Reza Shah's dream seemed to have been realized. He had a railway, a modern army, a secular education system, and a new name that commanded respect. But beneath the surface, the foundations were cracking. His modernization was top-down. He had built a state, but he hadn't built a nation that felt included in it. He had alienated the clergy, crushed the merchants of the bazaar with state monopolies, and kept the peasantry in their feudal conditions. He had become increasingly paranoid, imprisoning or executing his own most loyal ministers. And then there was the oil. Despite all his talk of sovereignty, the lifeblood of the Iranian economy, the oil in the southwest, was still controlled by the British. In 1932, in a fit of rage, the Shah had personally cancelled the oil concession, throwing the contract into a fireplace. But as Qatar Digital Library notes, the British simply took him to the League of Nations. The Shah was forced to back down, signing a new deal in 1933 that extended British control for another 60 years. It was a bitter pill. It proved that no matter how many railways he built or how many names he changed, the giants, Britain and Russia, still held the keys to his house. As the 1930s drew to a close, the third force strategy began to look less like a master stroke and more like a trap. The German presence in Iran was growing. Thousands of German technicians, teachers, and tourists were in the country. To Reza Shah, they were the architects of his modern state. To the British and the Soviets, they were a fifth column of Nazi spies sitting on top of the world's most important oil fields and supply routes. In 1935, Reza Shah Pahlavi thought he had won. He had reclaimed the name Iran. He had asserted his sovereignty. He believed he had finally escaped the shadow of the British lion and the Russian bear by shaking hands with the German eagle. But he had forgotten the oldest rule of the great game. When the giants go to war, the ground they stand on gets crushed. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The world caught fire. Reza Shah declared Iran neutral, hoping to sit out the storm. But neutrality is a luxury that oil-rich nations rarely enjoy. The very German partnership he built to save Iran's independence was about to become the excuse for its destruction. Next time, in Part 2, the invasion. The dream of sovereignty turns into a nightmare of occupation. The third force fails. The Shah is forced into a humiliating exile, and Iran becomes the bridge to victory for the very empires it tried to escape.